This is Antithesis, your underground academic radio where the focus is on you. For those that are in the thick of it today, we know what you are living through. And for those that chose or were forced onto a different path, we know what it costs. We're here to be your companion and to help you reorient your compass a bit, to help make sense of it all. Thanks for being here. The opinions expressed here are my own and do not reflect those of my employer or any entity professionally affiliated with me. Topics in these podcasts will be familiar to many, if not all, within the academic and scientific communities, within institutions, industries, and employers of all kinds. Some of these topics may be of a highly sensitive nature to certain listeners, particularly those that have experienced or are experiencing them, and could trigger some emotions that are upsetting or distressing. I've created this space to speak openly about these topics with the broader goal of helping individuals cope, adjust, and adapt constructively to the many challenges at hand. With that said, thank you for joining me. Antithesis, Episode 8, Responsibilities. Hello everyone, thanks for taking a moment to join me today. This is our 8th episode, and thus far we've covered a wide variety of topics. These included ethics and fidelity in doing science, particularly in the wake of more data manipulation and fraud scandals, how to handle and redefine what I deemed the currency of doing successful science, and that is failure, how to work to ascribe value to yourself on an immensely challenging path, which for many of you, an academic research journey leads to the goal of landing a professorship, and for listeners in the non-academic world, potentially what you might consider a dream job. And some anecdotes and lessons learned revolving around how much trust could and should be held around all of the processes in academia because they're human driven and facilitated, including in the prior episodes some experiences of the whole array of different personalities and barriers that can and will be experienced when it comes to interviewing. And while episode 7 centered around faculty job interviews, the sentiments can be very similar to for interviews for graduate school or postdoctoral positions as well, or any other job. Today, I want to split some time between two topics, both of which fit into the grand scheme of the meaning of education, the meaning of science, and the values that should be instilled in them both, but also the importance of fulfilling the responsibilities that are paired with the taking up of this mantle. To everyone under your watch, in the laboratory and in the classroom, and this ain't just professors we're talking about here, those of you graduate teaching assistants out there listening right now, but it is also fulfilling responsibilities to yourself. Now, I admit when I state the word responsibilities, it might sound as if I'm dictating absolutes or demanding extra work and time and effort, but I ask listeners to hold off on that worst case scenario, just for the moment. So please keep an open mind, and I'll elaborate on what I mean by responsibilities. After I taught my large lecture molecular biology course for a handful of semesters, it was the late 2000s, early 2010s, and it was becoming abundantly clear that there was a notable shift in the viewpoint of the public on what science was, what science meant. And to put it in the simplest of terms, tremendous skepticism continues to grow and amplify and become truly pervasive throughout the public's view of science. Paired with my research efforts, as my teaching in undergraduate and graduate classrooms continued, it was becoming apparent to me that my role in conveying principles and practices of molecular and cellular biology extended further than simply highlighting aspects of these subjects and testing knowledge and capabilities of the students sitting before me. I have touched briefly on teaching and learning in a prior episode, and I will continue to do so throughout the series. But what had begun to resonate with me more than anything was that I was teaching principles of learning, more than of just a specific topic. Of course, I was teaching a biological topic, but how I wanted to inspire and improve in students and encapsulate key fundamentals and attributes of independent thought and reasoning based on concrete data and evidence. That was something that evolved in me very quickly. It became apparent that so much of what we do on a college or university campus is founded in the basis of training to apply rational thought into solving complex problems. But tying these principles back into real life for so many of these topics that could seem completely distant and esoteric from quote unquote real life is simply not usually par for the course. Let's be honest. Even teaching an undergraduate molecular biology course and some of its topics, which would have some relevance to students wanting to pursue medical school or graduate school, sometimes students would be in the course for other reasons, or maybe they took the course and ended up changing their paths entirely. But why is it so uncommon to have a classroom experience, especially if it's a large lecture, which is commonplace at large research universities, that can actually resonate directly to the heart of each person? I recall teaching my course, and we were upon the topic of mutagens, and these are chemical compounds that can cause DNA to be mutated. And cellular systems have evolved to be able to repair these things, and we compare the differences between DNA repair mechanisms in human cells, all the way back to the beginning with bacteria, and talking about mutagens and chemicals that can cause DNA mutations and repair systems all the way from bacteria to human cells, etc. It really hit me. How do I grab the audience? How do we talk about this? Well, obviously mutations and cancer are topics that can come to mind. And I remember thinking about how I wanted to pose this to my audience. How is it that you capture the attention of each individual in a 300 plus person audience? And then it really hit me. This is a heavy topic, especially if I'm going to talk about cancer. But it was an opportunity to empower and help instill rational views, employing science concepts that we are presenting and learning to help inform and reduce fear of the unknown. And I remember talking about statistics and looking at 300 students and saying, I look at all of you in the audience today and myself here on the stage. Some of us are going to get cancer in our lifetimes. And I wanted to approach that in a way where it wasn't so mysterious, and not, of course, because I could describe the reasons why a specific cancer was formed in an individual or what types of cancers some of us would be getting. But the fact of the matter is, science says that and statistics says that. But how is it that we can help young people think rationally, and especially when it comes to unknown and such fearful topics? Bring up the fact that we've all lost people in our lives with cancer, without question, and we will continue to do so. And some of us, right in that room on that day, would also be impacted by cancer. So, how do we help inform and empower people, even in those types of moments, to think rationally and logically and not be so afraid, but be prepared and to have a desire to gain an understanding for something as frightening and unknown as cancer? Because in that moment, you're left with, do I blame myself? Who do I blame for this? And to try to express to young minds to embrace the fundamentals and the basics and realize so many billions of processes are happening in our bodies and our cells at one time. And at that stage, to not feel so upset and lost, confused, still feeling that way, no doubt, but to realize these things are so complex, errors can happen sometimes. And that is to be a bit empowering, to provide a bit of courage to realize you can't blame yourself for certain things to happen to you. Whether you had the best or the worst habits in your life at times, where do you put that blame? And sometimes it comes down to just having that fundamental understanding of how these things can work and all the immense things that your body can achieve and what it can overcome at times, but also the errors that can happen. And reducing that mystery empowers everyone. While I brought this up in my classroom and felt the concern, thinking, I don't want students to get lost into a moment of sadness or being upset because of someone they knew or they lost, or even people that had cancer at that very moment, to try to empower individuals to realize you can break these things down into real concrete fundamentals and to take away the mystery of that unknown. And while that doesn't reduce the pain or the hurt of thinking of someone you lost that had cancer, or of people that have cancer, or the fact that some of us are going to be getting cancer, to try to remove that mystery at least puts the power back into your hands. And I wanted really to exude that and exemplify that, especially with that particular topic in my classroom. This is one of many stories and examples where I felt it was crucial, uh, for lack of a better expression, to bring right home the topics we were covering as personally as possible, to have an impact so that what was being learned could move the needles. And yes, plural needles, the needle of independent thinking, the needle of understanding, the needle of empowerment. And I did this as frequently as possible in my classroom, in every instance where I could express some intersection or maybe a parallel to concepts and topics all people deal with in one form or another, whether you're a 19 or 20-year-old student in my classroom or an adult out in the real world. During my last handful of lectures, teaching my large lecture course of undergraduates, I remember stating these words more or less with emphasis. What you have known in your prior life, what you have heard, what you were told, what you were led to believe. Now is the time here to take your prior experiences, your biases, and maybe even some firmly held beliefs, and set them free, even if for just a moment. Like with law, science must be approached and done with no passion or prejudice. Look at a situation, make your observations from the most neutral standpoint you can achieve, and then derive from all the data and evidence that is sound, rebuild your view, draw your thoughts, and view, from the most dispassionate standpoint you possibly can, your concepts, your conclusions. I told my students, no matter what you become in this life, I want you to be of a scientific mind wherever you are, as a citizen, maybe not only here from the United States, but of the world. We need you to use rational thought and a scientific mindset to make the best decisions possible for us all. This was more than a decade ago. Now, a decade later, my views and stances on the role of all of education to our national security has reached a pinnacle and continues to climb. And it should have been and should always be a core tenet to every student, and especially those at colleges and universities. And this is where the responsibilities lie with each of these institutions and those charged with facilitating undergraduate and graduate education. Just this week, in the November 15th issue of Science Journal, the president of the United States National Academy of Sciences, Dr. Marcia McNutt, wrote an editorial entitled "Science is Neither Red Nor Blue." This is only a one pager, but I want to share a few phrases with you. And you can either Google "Science is Neither Red Nor Blue" to find it, or you can find the direct link to the editorial in the description section of this episode. Quote, "Scientists need to better explain the norms and values of science to reinforce the notion with the public and their elected representatives that science, at its most basic, is apolitical. No politics involved. Scientists should better explain the scientific process and what makes it so trustworthy, while more candidly acknowledging that science can only provide the best available evidence and cannot dictate what people should value. Science cannot say whether society should prioritize allocating river water for sustaining fish or for irrigating farms, but it can predict immediate and long-term outcomes of any allocation scheme. Although scientists must never shirk their duty to provide the foundation of evidence that can guide policy decisions and to defend science and scientists from political interference, they must avoid the tendency to imply that science dictates policy. That is up to elected officials to determine policy based on the outcomes desired by their constituents. It is the role of science to inform these decision makers as to whether those desired outcomes are likely to result from the policies being enacted. And lastly, quote, "It is up to society and its elected leadership to decide how to balance these options, including the use of renewable energy, climate adaptation, carbon capture, or even various interventions that reflect sunlight back into space." And I want to emphasize on one point made by Dr. McNutt here. It is the role of science to inform these decision makers as to whether those desired outcomes are likely to result from the policies being enacted. And we, as scientists and educators, must communicate openly and fairly and in the most friendly way possible, dispassionately, to try to get our policymakers, but to try to get our constituents, to try to get all of you listening and otherwise, to understand the advantages, but the caveats also of what science brings and what that means to help us make the best decisions possible. So it's really in our hands. And being in an undergraduate and graduate classroom, I realized how key that was. It wasn't just about the science and the topic, and it wasn't really about learning, but it was trying to express accountability for every student that ever passed through my classroom and to make sure they owned that for wherever they went in life after they were done with my class and their education. To sum up this first part, underscoring here what responsibilities means to you in this context: educators, teachers, scientists, graduate students, teaching assistants, professors, but truly anyone listening to this that can embrace the tenets of education and science that shed light on reality. We need you all. We need you all now more than ever to inspire, to find and take the time, even if only a little, maybe in the cracks and crevices of your lessons, maybe even simply in conversations when any opportune moment arises, to extol the virtues of evidence and knowledge and demystification of so much that can seem so intimidating and frightening that we put ourselves at even greater risk. To work to inspire the best I could get out of my students in my classrooms, I truly laid down the gauntlet because I had always felt that the example of me investing myself in their progress might instill and inspire a greater hunger and curiosity in each of them, but also help them raise the bar for themselves higher than any of them might have thought possible. By the time a semester ended, for some, it was a successful and fruitful approach, I believe. For others, I'm only left to wonder if they remember, as months and years passed, at least the following tenet: as you make a choice, a decision, for anything that has consequence, use your best judgment without passion or prejudice, based on the most sound evidence you have before you. For some of you, adopting these tenets as a responsibility in your mentoring and teaching might feel a bit out of place. maybe even strange. But these are generally never virtues extolled to any teaching assistant and professors by anyone. Well, okay, what virtues usually are extolled to teaching assistants and professors at all, you might ask? Well, that's true. What are they taught and what are they trained to do in their classrooms? That's another topic for another time. But what is key that I want you to understand is that you have purpose in who you are, what you are doing, and where you are doing it. So share the responsibility that you've taken and pass it along to your students and trainees. And this is a bond that will have value for some immediately and others in time. How do I make my students care? Is such a pervasive question for most academics that stand up in front of a classroom. It is no understatement that giving them purpose is a first step, but you need to truly embrace this purpose first. And I'm telling you, the United States and the world needs you to take up this mantle. And this is where you are invaluable. Now, on to our second of two responsibilities for this episode. And we segue from that prior statement to this one. You are invaluable, and you must take responsibility to care for yourself. A second article to which I've provided a link in the description of this episode was just published in the Journal of Nature Biotechnology. It's also free. It is entitled, quote, Behind the Graduate Mental Health Crisis in Science, end quote. Here I want to read a couple of snippets. In 2018, researchers declared a graduate student mental health crisis after finding that master's and PhD students were significantly more likely to report anxiety and depression compared to their peers in the general population. The crisis garnered particular concern with the scientific community given the notoriously stressful culture of science and the disproportionate effect that anxiety and depression are known to have on identity groups that the scientific community is trying to recruit and retain, including women, individuals from low socioeconomic backgrounds, members of the LGBTQ plus community, individuals with marginalized racial or ethnic identities, and people with disabilities. As a result, scientific organizations amplify the urgent need to make science graduate education more inclusive for students struggling with mental health. However, over the past 5 years, graduate student mental health has continued to deteriorate, partially owing to the paucity of knowledge about how science graduate programs affect students' mental health. And here they report the ways in which students' anxiety and depression impact their research and teaching. Now, for some of you, I can imagine the last thing you might want to do is look up this paper and read all the conclusions gathered, because you already know it firsthand. You feel it, you're living it, and if you haven't yet, you likely will. As well as all the factors and challenges that are increasing your anxiety, can cause depression, and so on. A big part of why I'm doing this series is because I remember it vividly myself, and these feelings extended through the thread of my academic progression all the way to becoming a faculty member. We've already touched on some principles and practices in earlier episodes, but I wanted to tie in this as such a crucial second component of your responsibilities, because without you, there's nothing, and we all lose. We need you in the pursuit for education and discovery and innovation and truth. And non-academic folks, you better be listening closely as well, because when it all boils down to it, every one of us plays a role, academic or not. For today, and with taking care of you as one of your two key responsibilities, remember your value proposition. I value you. I value your pursuit of learning and discovery and growth, because no matter who or where you are or even what you do, it makes us all better and better off. Also, remember self-forgiveness when stuff just doesn't go right or according to plan. Because as I've said before, and I'll say it again, and I'll continue to do so, this is all about learning during each step forward. And learning and gaining from failure is the currency that it takes to cross that bridge and keep you moving forward. Be the steward of science, education, and rational, true evidence-based thought for all in your stead and orbit. Be the steward for yourself and for your health so you can make that difference. And with that, thanks so much for joining me today. And I hope you look forward to our next episode that will be released in a week's time. And no matter on which platform you heard today's episode, if you enjoyed it and want to hear more, please subscribe, follow, like, and share. And set your notifications to let you know that the next fresh episode is ready for you to dig in. All of you, keep building up your courage, hang in there, and keep your head up. We'll talk to you again soon. continuing 30 years of experience with stories in and beyond the academic realm. Antithesis is a podcast that will take these perspectives and philosophies and pull them, along with you, the student, the researcher, the innovator, the educator, into the sunlight. Join us for some firsthand experiences, insights from inside and outside academia, and perspectives that are aimed at redefining the conventions of academia and your training, with the aim of helping you reorient your compass and strengthen you on your journey forward, or to recover and grow from those times past. We'd love to have you follow us and tune in weekly. If you have a topic you'd like discussed or a challenge you are facing you want to share, email us at allsystemsgo@gmail.com. That is ALLSYST3MSGO@gmail.com.